December 1941. Somewhere along the frozen approaches to Moscow, a young German Panzer commander stands in the cupola of his Mark III, scanning the white horizon through field glasses that fog with every breath. The temperature has dropped to 20 degrees below zero. His crew huddles inside the cramped steel hull, their hands wrapped in whatever fabric they can find, their feet already numb despite the thin woolen socks issued back in Poland. The engine idles roughly, burning precious gasoline that grows scarcer with each passing day. Everything is white. The sky bleeds into the earth without distinction, without mercy. Snow falls in thick curtains that muffle sound and erase the world beyond 50 meters. And then, through that curtain, something moves. The commander sees it first as a shadow, a darker gray against the pale gray of the storm. Then the shadow takes form, low, wide, sloped. The turret swings toward them with mechanical precision. There is no warning scream of engine noise, no telltale squeal of tracks on frozen ground. Just the sudden, terrible realization that they are already in the gun sights. The commander screams into the intercom. The gunner traverses frantically. Their 75-millimeter barks once, twice. Both shells ricochet off the sloped armor in showers of sparks that briefly illuminate the snowfall like fireworks. The return shot comes 3 seconds later. The Mark III shudders, metal screams, and everything inside becomes fire and flying shrapnel. The war diary of the 18th Panzer Division would later record the loss of 4 tanks that afternoon to an enemy that seemed to materialize from the blizzard itself. The entry notes, with unusual candor, that crews reported hearing the Soviet tanks only moments before impact, despite the open terrain. One officer wrote in the margin a single word in pencil: "Ghost. This was not how it was supposed to be." 6 months earlier, when Operation Barbarossa commenced in the pre-dawn hours of June 22, 1941, the German Wehrmacht had rolled across the Soviet border with supreme confidence. 3 million men, 3,000 aircraft, 3,500 tanks, the largest invasion force ever assembled in human history, launched against an enemy that German intelligence had assessed as inferior in training, equipment, and leadership. Soviet military doctrine was believed to be in shambles following Stalin's brutal purges of the officer corps in the late 1930s. German panzer divisions had swept through Poland in weeks, crushed France in 6 weeks, and sent British forces fleeing at Dunkirk. The tanks that led these victories, the Mark III and Mark IV Panzers, were considered among the finest fighting vehicles in the world. Their crews were veterans, their tactics proven, their faith in German engineering absolute. The initial advances seemed to confirm every assumption. Soviet forces fell back in disarray. Entire armies were encircled and destroyed in massive cauldron battles. Hundreds of thousands of prisoners trudged westward under guard. German tank commanders reported destroying obsolete Soviet tanks in droves, the BT series and T-34’s models that seemed to belong to an earlier war. These machines had thin armor that German anti-tank guns could penetrate at ridiculous ranges. Their crews were often poorly trained, their tactics predictable. The advance continued at a pace that amazed even the German high command. Minsk fell, Smolensk fell. The road to Moscow seemed open. And then, in the dust and summer heat of Ukraine, German tankers began encountering something different. The first reports were fragmentary, confused. A tank of unknown type, heavier than expected, with armor that deflected standard anti-tank rounds. Initial assessments suggested perhaps a new variant of an existing model, nothing to fundamentally alter tactical planning. But as summer turned to autumn and the first encounters became pitched battles, the truth became impossible to ignore. The Soviet Union had deployed a medium tank that was, in almost every measurable way, superior to anything Germany had on the Eastern Front. It was called the T-34. The T-34 was the product of a design philosophy that emphasized the brutal practicalities of mechanized warfare over the engineering elegance that characterized German tank development. Designed by Mikhail Koshkin and his team at the Kharkov Locomotive Factory, the T-34 incorporated lessons learned from the Spanish Civil War and the border conflicts with Japan at Khalkhin Gol. Soviet designers had observed that most tank casualties came from hits on vertical armor plates, and that mobility in difficult terrain often mattered more than maximum speed on roads. They had also noted that the majority of tank engagements occurred at ranges under 1,000 meters, where a powerful gun mattered more than elaborate fire control systems. The result was a machine that looked, to Western eyes, almost crude in its simplicity. But that simplicity concealed revolutionary innovation. The armor scheme was the first shock. Instead of vertical plates that presented a flat surface to incoming fire, the T-34's hull was steeply sloped at angles approaching 60 degrees from the vertical. This meant that an incoming shell, rather than striking the armor at a perpendicular angle where it could apply maximum penetrating force, would instead strike at an oblique angle. The effective thickness of the armor increased dramatically without adding weight. A 45mm plate angled at 60 degrees became equivalent to a 90mm vertical plate in terms of protection. German gunners watched in disbelief as their rounds, which could reliably penetrate 50mm of vertical armor, bounced off the T-34's glacis plate like stones skipping on water. The turret continued this philosophy, with rounded contours that further increased the likelihood of deflection. Early German after-action reports noted that even when armor-piercing rounds struck the T-34, they frequently failed to penetrate, instead leaving bright scars on the armor and ricocheting away into the distance. The gun was the second shock. The T-34 mounted a 76.2mm high-velocity cannon, the F-34, which could fire both armor-piercing and high-explosive rounds with devastating effect. At typical combat ranges, this weapon could penetrate the frontal armor of any German tank then in service. The Mark III, which formed the backbone of Panzer divisions, had only 30mm of frontal armor on early models, later increased to 50mm with applique plates that still proved inadequate. Even the Mark IV, with its 80mm frontal armor on later variants, could be penetrated by the T-34's gun at ranges exceeding 1,000 meters. German tank commanders found themselves in the nightmarish situation of fighting an enemy who could kill them from distances at which they could not effectively return fire. Standard doctrine had to be rewritten. Frontal engagements were to be avoided. Flanking maneuvers became essential. Even then, the T-34 side armor was often sufficient to defeat German rounds, especially at longer ranges or impact angles. The mobility was the third shock, and in many ways the most psychologically devastating. The T-34 rode on wide tracks that distributed its weight over a large surface area, giving it ground pressure of only 0.62 kilograms per square centimeter. German tanks, with their narrower tracks optimized for European roads, exerted significantly higher ground pressure. The practical result was visible in every season on the Eastern Front. In the spring Rasputitsa, when melting snow turned the vast Russian steppes into seas of mud, German panzers sank to their hulls and required hours of exhausting work to extract. T-34s drove through the same mud with relative ease, their wide tracks churning forward where German machines could only wallow. In winter, when snow accumulated in drifts that could swallow a man to his waist, German tanks again struggled, while T-34s maintained mobility. The psychological impact on German crews cannot be overstated. They began to feel like they were fighting the land itself, that Russia was an ally to the Soviet tanks and an enemy to their own machines. But it was the engine that gave the T-34 its most distinctive characteristic, the one that would eventually fuel the legend of the silent hunter in the snow. The T-34 was powered by a V2 diesel engine, a 12-cylinder power plant that produced 500 horsepower and gave the 30-ton tank a power-to-weight ratio superior to most German designs. Diesel engines were rare in tanks at that time. Most nations, including Germany, relied on gasoline engines which were lighter, more responsive, and easier to manufacture using existing automotive industry infrastructure. But diesel offered crucial advantages. It was less flammable than gasoline, reducing the catastrophic fire risk when a tank was penetrated. It provided better fuel efficiency, extending operational range, and it produced a distinctly different acoustic signature. A gasoline engine in a tank produces a higher-pitched mechanical sound, a sharp whine mixed with the clatter of valves and gears. The sound carries well across open terrain and has a quality that the human ear readily identifies as mechanical, as artificial. A diesel engine, by contrast, produces a deeper, more resonant rumble. The sound has more bass frequencies, which are more easily absorbed by terrain features and atmospheric conditions. In open summer fields, this difference might be negligible. But in the specific conditions of the Eastern Front in winter, it became tactically significant. Snow is an acoustic dampener. Fresh snow, with its irregular crystalline structure and air pockets, absorbs sound waves more effectively than almost any natural material. A snow-covered battlefield becomes acoustically dead in a way that soldiers from temperate climates find deeply unsettling. Sounds that would normally carry for kilometers are muffled to mere hundreds of meters. The direction of sounds becomes difficult to determine as snow absorbs the higher frequencies that help human ears localize noise sources. And in a blizzard, when wind-driven snow fills the air and visibility drops to almost nothing, the acoustic environment becomes even more confused. Wind noise masks other sounds. Temperature inversions bend sound waves in unexpected directions. What should be loud becomes quiet. What should be close sounds distant. In these conditions, the T-34's diesel engine gave it what amounted to a form of acoustic camouflage. Not because it was objectively quiet. Any veteran who served in a T-34 would laugh at that suggestion. Inside the hull, the noise was deafening, a constant roar of engine and transmission combined with the metallic clanking of tracks and the squeal of road wheels. External microphones would register the T-34 as producing significant noise at reasonable distances. But to a German soldier standing in a snow-covered field, straining to hear approaching danger through layers of winter clothing and the deadening effect of snow, the T-34's approach could seem terrifyingly sudden. The deep diesel rumble, already more muted than a gasoline engine, would be further dampened by snow and wind until it became indistinguishable from the background noise of the battlefield. And then, with shocking abruptness, the tank would emerge from the white curtain at ranges where engagement was immediate and survival uncertain. German accounts from the winter of 1941 and 1942 reflect this experience in language that sometimes borders on the supernatural. A lieutenant with the 4th Panzer Division wrote in a letter home that the Russian tanks seemed to rise from the snow itself, that one moment the field was empty, and the next moment they were under fire from machines that towered over his position like iron monsters. A corporal with an anti-tank gun unit recorded in his diary that his crew had been killed before they ever heard the enemy approaching, that he survived only because he had been some distance from the gun when the T-34 appeared and fired. A tank commander noted in his after-action report that his platoon had been ambushed by Soviet tanks that his radio operator swore he never heard on the approach, despite clear weather and good visibility. "The crews are terrified of them," he wrote. "They fear the Russian tank more than Russian infantry, more than artillery, perhaps more than anything except the cold itself." This fear had a rational basis. The tactical situation German tank crews faced when encountering T-34's was objectively terrifying. Standard doctrine called for tanks to engage targets at maximum effective range, using superior optics and fire control to achieve first-hit kills before the enemy could return fire. Against the T-34, this doctrine collapsed. German tanks could fire first, and frequently did, only to watch their rounds ricochet harmlessly away. The T-34 would then return fire with a gun that could kill with a single hit. Even when German gunners achieved penetrating hits on T-34's, the Soviet tanks often remained operational. The diesel fuel was less likely to ignite than gasoline. The spacious internal layout meant that a single penetration might wound or kill one crew member without incapacitating the entire vehicle. German tankers reported instances of T-34's continuing to fight after sustaining multiple penetrating hits, finally withdrawing under their own power, while German tanks that had scored what should have been killing shots were left burning wrecks. The winter of 1941 to 1942 became a crucible in which these technical and tactical realities combined with environmental extremes to create conditions of almost unbearable stress for German forces. The offensive toward Moscow had stalled. Supply lines were overstretched. The German army, equipped and trained for rapid mobile warfare in temperate climates, found itself fighting a static battle in conditions for which it was catastrophically unprepared. Temperatures dropped to minus 40 degrees Celsius and below. Lubricants froze. Engine blocks cracked. Weapons jammed. Men died of exposure in shocking numbers. And through the snow and cold, Soviet forces launched counteroffensives spearheaded by T-34's that seemed impervious to both German fire and Russian winter. It was in this context that the myth of the T-34's silence in the snow took root. Myth is perhaps too strong a word, as it implies complete fabrication. Better to call it a legend, a story grounded in real experience but amplified by fear and exhaustion and the simple human need to explain the inexplicable. German soldiers, many of them young men who had grown up in comfortable middle-class homes, found themselves in a frozen hell fighting an enemy they had been told was inferior, but who seemed to command weapons and tactics they could not match. The T-34 became the physical embodiment of their predicament. Its sloped armor represented the failure of German technological superiority. Its powerful gun represented the vulnerability of German defenses. And its ability to appear suddenly in snow and fog represented the fundamental alienness of the Eastern Front itself, a place where the rules they had learned in France and Poland no longer applied. Soviet tactical doctrine contributed to this psychological effect, whether deliberately or through fortunate accident. Soviet tank commanders understood the value of terrain and weather as weapons. They used tree lines and snow squalls as concealment for approach marches. They painted their tanks in winter camouflage, whitewashing the hulls and turrets until they blended into the snow. They exploited the acoustic properties of the environment, using engine noise to mask their approach or timing attacks to coincide with periods of high wind when sound would not carry. German defensive positions, designed around long sight lines and overlapping fields of fire, became death traps when visibility dropped to 50 meters, and the first indication of attack was the impact of 76mm shells. The Battle of Moscow in December 1941 provided numerous examples of this phenomenon. Soviet counteroffensives, launched in brutal winter conditions, used T-34's as breakthrough weapons to penetrate German lines and exploit into the rear areas. German accounts describe Soviet tanks appearing without warning, during blizzards, overrunning positions before defenders could react. In one incident recorded by the 7th Panzer Division, a Soviet tank column approached a German defensive line during heavy snowfall and was not detected until the lead T-34 was within 200 meters of the forward positions. The ensuing engagement was brief and catastrophic for the defenders. The Germans lost 11 tanks and 4 anti-tank guns destroyed, with another 6 tanks damaged. Soviet losses were 2 T-34's destroyed and 1 immobilized. The division's after-action report noted that acoustic detection had failed due to weather conditions, and that visual detection had been impossible until the enemy was already within decisive range. Technical solutions were desperately sought. German anti-tank gun crews were issued the 88mm flak gun in the anti-tank role, a powerful weapon originally designed for anti-aircraft work that could reliably penetrate T-34 armor at reasonable ranges. But these guns were heavy, difficult to conceal, and available in limited numbers. German tank designers began work on up-gunned and up-armored versions of existing tanks, programs that would eventually produce the Panther and Tiger. But these machines would not reach the front in significant numbers until 1943. In the meantime, German forces had to make do with inadequate weapons and improvised tactics. Tank commanders were instructed to aim for the T-34's tracks, attempting to immobilize the Soviet tanks so that heavier weapons could be brought to bear or airstrikes called in. Infantry anti-tank teams were taught to close with T-34's and attack weak points with magnetic mines and explosive charges. These tactics sometimes worked, but they required levels of courage and skill that could not be sustained across an entire front, and the casualty rates were appalling. The Soviet Union, despite catastrophic losses in 1941 that saw millions of soldiers captured and thousands of tanks destroyed, maintained production of the T-34 at levels that staggered German intelligence analysts. Factories in Moscow were evacuated east to the Urals, transported piece by piece on rail cars while German bombs fell on emptying facilities. At Tankograd, the massive tank production complex in Chelyabinsk, workers labored in unheated factories at temperatures that froze the machines they were building. Production techniques were ruthlessly simplified. Components that required precision machining were redesigned for crude but functional manufacturing. Welds replaced bolts. Rough castings replaced fine castings. Quality control was relaxed to the point where tanks rolled off production lines with flaws that would be unthinkable in a German factory. And yet they worked. They worked well enough to fight, well enough to win. By the end of 1941, despite losing more than 20,000 tanks in the German onslaught, the Soviet Union was actually producing more tanks per month than Germany, and the majority of those tanks were T-34's. This industrial capacity, combined with the T-34's battlefield superiority, created a situation where German forces on the Eastern Front faced not just a superior weapon, but an endless tide of superior weapons. Every destroyed T-34 would be replaced by two more. Every Soviet defeat would be followed by another offensive, more tanks, more attacks. German soldiers began to speak of the Eastern Front as a meat grinder, a place where men and machines were consumed without end and without meaning. The T-34 became the symbol of this existential dread. It was the monster that could not be killed, the enemy that multiplied with every victory, the machine that hunted them through the snow and would not stop. Historians examining German wartime documents from the Eastern Front note a recurring pattern in how encounters with T-34's were described. Early reports from the summer and autumn of 1941 focus on technical details: armor thickness, gun performance, mobility characteristics. These are the reports of professional soldiers encountering a weapon system they did not expect and working to understand its capabilities. But as winter set in and the reports continued, the language changes. Words like ghost, phantom, monster begin to appear. Reports describe T-34's appearing as if from nowhere, materializing in fog and snow, striking and vanishing before effective response could be organized. Some of this was certainly propaganda, efforts by junior officers to explain defeats that might otherwise be blamed on their leadership. Some was likely exaggeration born of exhaustion and trauma. But the consistency of these accounts across different units, different locations, different times suggests something more. It suggests a genuine psychological phenomenon, a collective fear that gripped German forces and reshaped how they understood the war they were fighting. The winter battles of 1941 to 1942 established patterns that would persist throughout the Eastern Front campaign. Soviet forces would use winter conditions to launch major offensives, knowing that German mobility and logistics would be degraded by cold and snow, while their own forces, equipped for winter warfare and using vehicles designed for harsh conditions, would retain effectiveness. T-34's would play a central role in these offensives, operating in conditions where German tanks struggled. The acoustic and visual masking effects of winter weather would be exploited to achieve surprise, and German soldiers would continue to report encounters with Soviet tanks that seemed to emerge from the snow itself, silent until the moment of firing, unstoppable once engaged. One particularly striking account comes from the memoirs of a German tank ace who survived the war and wrote candidly about his experiences. He describes a January morning in 1942 when his company of 10 Mark III tanks was ordered to retake a village that had fallen to a Soviet counterattack the previous night. The weather was clear but bitterly cold, minus 30 degrees with deep snow covering the ground. His platoon approached from the south, moving in tactical formation with intervals of about 100 meters between vehicles. They had covered perhaps 3 kilometers when the commander's tank, in the lead position, was hit and destroyed. The shot came from the left flank, from a tree line roughly 500 meters distant. Before his crew could react, 2 more tanks were hit in rapid succession. The company commander ordered an immediate withdrawal under smoke. As they retreated, he caught a glimpse of the attackers through the smoke and blowing snow. 3 T-34's, painted white, emerging from the trees. He had been scanning that tree line throughout the approach and had seen nothing. Even now, knowing exactly where the Soviet tanks were, he could barely distinguish them from the background. The sound of their engines was completely lost in the wind, and the roar of his own tank, and the explosions of incoming fire. We felt hunted, he wrote, like deer that had wandered into the sights of patient wolves. They had known we were coming, they had waited in perfect concealment, and we had driven straight into the kill zone without ever seeing them or hearing them or having any chance at all. This combination of technical superiority, tactical skill, and environmental advantage made the T-34 perhaps the most feared individual weapon system German forces faced on the Eastern Front. More German soldiers died from artillery fire, more casualties were inflicted by small arms and disease, and the simple environmental extremes of the Russian front. But the T-34 occupied a unique place in the German soldiers' imagination because it represented everything that had gone wrong with the invasion. It was a weapon they were supposed to outclass, but did not. It was produced by an industrial base they were supposed to have crippled, but had not. It was operated by soldiers they were supposed to have demoralized, but who kept fighting. And it hunted them through landscapes that felt utterly alien, emerging from snow and fog and forests like something from a nightmare. There and then gone, leaving only burning vehicles and dead comrades. By 1943, German industry had responded to the T-34 threat with new tank designs. The Panther tank incorporated many of the T-34's innovations, particularly its sloped armor scheme, while maintaining German traditions of precise engineering and complex mechanical systems. The Tiger tank, though not specifically designed to counter the T-34, provided German forces with a heavy tank that could engage Soviet armor at extreme ranges with near-guaranteed kills. These weapons, combined with improved anti-tank guns and better infantry anti-tank training, restored some measure of parity to armored combat on the Eastern Front. But the psychological damage was done. German forces never recovered the offensive momentum of 1941. Every advance was measured against unsustainable losses. Every victory was hollow when the enemy could replace its losses faster than Germany could replace its own. The war became one of attrition, and in wars of attrition, numbers matter more than individual quality. The T-34 continued to evolve throughout the war. The T-34-85 variant, introduced in 1944, mounted an 85mm gun in a larger turret and incorporated numerous improvements to crew ergonomics and mechanical reliability. This version was arguably the finest medium tank of the Second World War, combining firepower, protection, and mobility in a package that remained effective even against the latest German designs. Soviet tank armies equipped with T-34-85s spearheaded the great offensives of 1944 and 1945 that drove German forces back across Eastern Europe and ultimately into Germany itself. The tank that had first appeared in the summer of 1941 as an unexpected shock to German forces became the vehicle that brought the Red Army to Berlin. The legend of the T-34's silence in the snow persisted after the war, kept alive in memoirs and popular histories. Some accounts border on the fantastical, claiming the T-34 was so quiet it could approach to within meters of enemy positions without being heard. These claims are nonsense. The T-34 was a noisy machine by any objective measure. But the core truth beneath the legend remains valid. In the specific conditions of the Eastern Front in winter, with snow muffling sound and reducing visibility, with wind and cold degrading the effectiveness of German equipment and the alertness of German soldiers, and with Soviet crews skilled at using terrain and weather to mask their approach, the T-34 could achieve a degree of tactical surprise that seemed almost supernatural to its victims. The silence was not in the tank, but in the moment before impact, that brief span of time when death approached unseen and unheard through the white emptiness of the Russian winter. German veterans who survived the Eastern Front and spoke about their experiences in later years often mentioned the T-34 in terms that mixed respect and residual fear. They acknowledged it as a superior weapon that they had struggled to counter. They praised its design efficiency and the skill with which Soviet forces employed it, but they also spoke of the dread it inspired, the way its appearance on the battlefield changed the calculus of combat, the nightmares of being trapped in a burning tank after a penetrating hit, the exhaustion of fighting an enemy who kept coming no matter how many you destroyed. One veteran, interviewed decades after the war, was asked what single thing he remembered most vividly from his time in Russia. He thought for a long moment before answering. "The sound of the diesel engine," he said, "that deep rumble. I still hear it sometimes when I'm falling asleep, and I wake up cold." The T-34's impact extended far beyond its immediate battlefield effectiveness. It influenced tank design philosophy for decades, demonstrating that simplicity and ease of production could be as valuable as technical sophistication. Post-war Soviet tank designs, including the T-54/55 series that became the most produced tank in history, built directly on T-34 principles. Western tank designers also absorbed lessons from the T-34, particularly its revolutionary sloped armor scheme, which became standard on all subsequent armored vehicle designs. The Israeli Merkava, the American M1 Abrams, the German Leopard, every modern main battle tank shows the T-34's influence in its basic layout and protection scheme. But perhaps the T-34's most significant impact was on the course of the Second World War itself. When Operation Barbarossa launched in June 1941, German planners expected to defeat the Soviet Union in a single summer campaign, lasting perhaps 3 to 4 months. The appearance of the T-34 in significant numbers was one of the key factors that disrupted this timeline. German forces had to adapt tactics, wait for better weapons, and fight battles they had not expected to fight. This bought time for the Soviet Union to evacuate its industries, mobilize its vast population, and begin receiving aid from allied nations. The initial shock of encountering the T-34 in 1941 contributed to the German failure to take Moscow before winter. The continued presence of T-34s in ever-increasing numbers throughout 1942 made German offensive operations progressively more costly. By 1943, when the last major German offensive at Kursk ground to a halt in the largest tank battle in history, T-34s formed the backbone of Soviet armored forces that outnumbered and ultimately overwhelmed their opponents. The tank that had first appeared as a tactical surprise became a strategic weapon that helped turn the tide of the entire war. The soldiers who crewed T-34s paid a terrible price for their tank's battlefield superiority. The T-34, despite its many advantages, was a brutal machine to operate. Crew conditions were cramped and uncomfortable. Visibility from inside was poor, with limited and poorly designed vision devices. The turret was manually traversed in early models, requiring exhausting physical labor in combat. Communication between crew members was difficult over the engine noise, and communication between tanks in a unit was often impossible due to inadequate radios. The ammunition was stowed in vulnerable locations where a penetrating hit would likely ignite a catastrophic fire. Soviet tank crews called the T-34 a moving coffin, despite their recognition of its capabilities. Casualty rates among Soviet tank crews were horrific, with many crews surviving only a handful of engagements before being killed or wounded. The same design that made the T-34 easy to produce in vast numbers also made it expendable, and Soviet doctrine treated tanks and their crews as consumable resources to be used without hesitation or mercy. Yet they kept fighting. Through the terrible defeats of 1941, the desperate defensive battles of 1942, the grinding offensives of 1943 and 1944, and the final drive into Germany in 1945, Soviet tank crews climbed into their T-34s and drove toward the enemy. They knew the odds. They knew the risks. They knew that most of them would not survive the war. And they went anyway because the alternative was fascist victory, the enslavement or extermination of their people, the destruction of everything they fought to protect. The T-34 was the weapon they were given. They used it with skill and courage against an enemy that had expected them to collapse, but who instead found themselves facing a resilience and determination they could not break. In the final accounting, the T-34 stands as one of the most successful weapon systems in military history. More than 84,000 were produced, making it the second most produced tank ever. It served in conflicts on 5 continents and remained in active service with some nations into the 21st century. Its basic design proved so sound that upgraded variants remained competitive for decades after the war ended. But beyond statistics and technical specifications, the T-34 represents something more profound. It represents the industrial and human capacity of the Soviet Union to absorb catastrophic damage and not just survive, but ultimately prevail. It represents the reality that war is not decided by who has the most sophisticated weapons, but by who can produce enough adequate weapons and use them effectively. And it represents the experience of total war, where entire nations mobilize every resource, where civilians die in the millions, where soldiers fight not for glory but survival, where the line between victory and extermination becomes absolute. For the German soldiers who faced T-34's in the snow, all of this was distilled into moments of pure terror. The white landscape stretching to infinity, the muffled sounds of winter, the sudden appearance of the low-sloped silhouette, the deep rumble of the diesel engine, the flash of the gun, and then fire, smoke, death in the cold. They had come to Russia as conquerors, supremely confident in their superiority. They learned otherwise. They learned that the enemy they had dismissed as inferior possessed weapons and will beyond anything they had imagined. They learned that the vast spaces and brutal climate of the Eastern Front were themselves weapons that could be wielded against them. They learned what it meant to be afraid, truly afraid, not of death in the abstract, but of a specific machine that hunted them through the snow and could kill them before they ever knew it was there. The silence was never literal, but the fear was real. And that fear, multiplied across hundreds of thousands of soldiers, repeated in countless engagements across thousands of kilometers of front, sustained through 4 years of the most brutal combat in human history, helped determine the outcome of the Second World War. The T-34 did not win the war alone. No weapon system ever does. But it was there at every critical moment, breaking through German lines, exploiting breakthroughs, maintaining pressure when German forces needed respite, appearing from snow and fog and forest when defenders thought they were safe. It became, in the German soldier's mind, inseparable from the Eastern Front itself, the vast emptiness, the killing cold, and the machine that emerged from the white silence, bringing death on tracks that left no warning, only the deep rumble of the diesel engine and the flash of the 76mm gun and the certain knowledge that they had lost before they ever knew the fight had begun.